Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this online panel discussion hosted by Scientia Militaria, South African Journal of Military Studies. Scientia Militaria is an accredited academic journal that encourages debate on defense, security, and military affairs. Today we are discussing the MiG Diaries, fighter pilot memoirs and accounts of Cuban, South African Air Force, and Angolan air combat in Southern African skies. The MiG Diaries is an updated account of some of the aerial warfare encounters of the Angola conflict between 1976 and 1988. The aim of the MiG Diaries is to eradicate misconceptions and uncertainties related to the air war component of the Angolan conflict, and we are going to discuss some air power issues tonight. MiG Diaries was written by Eduardo Gonzalez Sarria from Cuba and Lionel Reid from South Africa. Eduardo flew MiG-21s and MiG-23s during 3 tours of duty in Angola, where he completed 78 combat missions and served as a MiG-23 squadron commander. After 26 years in the Cuban Air Force, he retired as lieutenant colonel with a master pilot rating. He lives in Havana and has written 2 books in Spanish about his experience prior to the MiG Diaries. Unfortunately, Eduardo cannot join us for the book's discussion today. I now want to introduce our panel members for this discussion, Lionel Reid, Cobus Toerien, and Hano van Eck. Lionel Reid, the co-author of the MiG Diaries, developed a fascination with military aviation at a young age. He joined the South African Air Force in 1983 and participated in the Angolan conflict from 1986 to 1989, flying Bosbok light reconnaissance aircraft and Puma helicopters. This was followed by a career in airline flying. He lives in Johannesburg and has spent 6 years researching the MiG Diaries. Our first panel expert is Cobus Toerien, who also features in the book. He received the South African Air Force Wings in 1975 and completed his BMO degree at the South African Military Academy in 1977. He served in the Angolan conflict from 1978 to 1988. During this time, he flew Impalas and Mirage F-1CZ aircraft with a total of 168 combat missions. Afterwards, he flew Cheetah aircraft as the commanding officer of 2 squadrons until 1999. This was followed by a career in airline flying until retirement, and today he is active in aviation safety and human factor training. Our second panel expert is Hano van Eck. He wrote a book review for Militaria on the MiG Diaries. Hano is sitting next to me on my left-hand side. He joined the South African Air Force in 1996 and completed his flying instructor's course in 1998. After obtaining a mechanical engineering degree at Stellenbosch University in 2004, he flew Hawks and Gripens at 85 Combat Flying School and 2 squadrons respectively. He joined the Military Academy as a lecturer in military technology in 2017 and completed his PhD in mechanical engineering in 2023. He lives in Vredenburg. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining this book discussion. I'm going to give the floor to Lionel as an opportunity to provide a background and overview of the book and themes, as well as to address some key questions on air power during this conflict. Thereafter, we will have a question and answer session, which Hano will help to facilitate. Lionel, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, gents. Just trying one last thing to share the screen, hopefully get the power if I can, and if I've also just tried to send it to you by WhatsApp, it'll be on its way to you now, and if you do maybe get it on WhatsApp and you could maybe set it up, maybe we'll be able to do that. Trying one last attempt to see if I can share the screen, and if not, then I'll just carry on with okay, no, it doesn't seem to have worked. Yeah, so tonight the discussion, where I'd like to structure it is, or just from my side, I'd like to make it on the evolution of the air threat in Angola. So I think it's rather interesting when one looks at that and has a look to see how the air threat from their side towards us evolved, both in terms of what they actually had and also in terms of the perception of what they had. So the place to start with that would be where the true offensive air threat started, which was right back in 1976. So in 1976, there were Cuban pilots that landed in Angola, and along with them arrived aircraft, the MiG-17 and the MiG-21. Now, up until then, the Angolan forces had no true, real offensive capability. But in January, that all changed of 76. Then by February of 1976, those aircraft had been assembled, they were flying, they began to take part in the conflict. And the first type I'd like to just touch on is the MiG-17, fairly old design by that stage. And when the MiG-17 arrived, its role was more ground attack. And the MiG-17 continued in the ground attack role for a number of years in Angola. No real air-to-air capability as such. And they were used in close air support in many of the campaigns, all the way up to 1983 in the Kangamba campaign, where that probably the last major campaign where that took place. With time, they were then sidelined and ended up just joining many of the derelict aircraft sitting at the side of the runways in the various Angolan airfields. I think one of the biggest contribution the MiG-17 perhaps made in the war was it formed the initial type for a lot of the Angolan pilots that flew later in the war to be trained on. The Cubans were already trained on it, and the Angolan pilots were then slowly brought in on the MiG-17 and then would move on to subsequent types. The MiG-21 that arrived in 1976 was the first time that they had a truly offensive air capability. Now they had a Mach 2 fighter that did have an air-to-air aspect to it. These were the MiG-21 MFs. There were 10 of them delivered along with two two-seat trainers. And these MFs had a cockpit setup very similar to the later Model B's cockpit. And the aircraft itself, they were manufactured in about 1975. They served for many years in the campaign, but in the initial years, Fidel Castro didn't want to use them in any way against South African forces. He didn't want the war to escalate, so they were used more in close air support as well against UNITA targets and various other targets. The missile that the MiG-23 MF came with was the old AA-2 Atoll missile, and in truth, it didn't have a great air-to-air capability. It was just a reverse-engineered AIM-9B Sidewinder, and it was only really good at being launched at a target that was running directly away from you. It wasn't a dogfight missile in any way. The standard configuration they would fly these in was a belly tank and 4 air-to-air missiles, and that's how they served in the air-to-air role, and they continued in that role without meeting the South African Air Force right up to 1981, and that's where everything changed, because that's the first time that they came up against the South African Air Force in combat. The aircraft that they would face would be the Mirage F1, which was also armed with older generation lag pursuit missile, which was the Matra 550. But in terms of the two aircraft, the Mirage F1 was ahead of the MiG-21 MF in capability, and as we know how the first combat went, the South African pilots were very well trained. The Cuban pilots were a mixture of rookies and experienced guys. And that day, the Mirage came up against a couple of more inexperienced guys and ended up with the first kill of the war, with Daniel Espinosa Valdez being shot down that day. In 1982, another combat took place, and once again, it ended up with the Mirages having the upper hand, and Cobus knows a lot about that particular combat. At the time, it was thought that that was also a kill, and it was thought that MiG C-40 had actually gone down, but it did make it back to base with a combination of good luck and some very good flying skill from the young pilot, Rachel Moreira. But in essence, the SAF had the upper hand comprehensively in these two encounters. But the first seeds were already sown there that there was a problem here, because in both those combats, the Matra missile never got within firing parameters or got within firing parameters and wasn't successful. In the second encounter, the second Matra blew up behind the one MiG-21, and the only damage it caused was really just a couple of scratches on the skin. But the success of the Mirages with the DEFA cannon kind of masked that factor that the Mirages didn't have an effective air-to-air missile here. And that's really where the air combats ended for a while. The Cubans withdrew behind a line that ran all the way from Lobito all the way through to Cuito Carnaval, and then they only used their aerial assets to defend that line. So the Mirages and the MiGs never encountered each other for many years, in fact 5 years. But what was actually happening on the Angolan side is that there was an increase in capability. MiG-21B's aircraft started to be delivered. Now these were better than the MFs in two aspects. The one aspect was that they had a far better afterburner, which gave them exceptional acceleration, in fact superior to that of a Mirage F1. But also they were now with a better missile capability. They came delivered with the R13M missile. That's its shape. It's pity you haven't got the PowerPoint presentation, but it's got a lot a pointier nose on it. It's got a nitrogen-cooled head. Its capability started to be in the vicinity of a AIM-9D or even G Sidewinder missile. These were never actually used in combat in the end, but what was happening, what was important is their equipment was evolving. And oh, wonderful, yeah. So thanks. I can see there's the presentation coming up now. If you could go on a couple, that's the MiG-21 MFs, some photos of the original MiG-21 MFs, and if you can just pause at that photo, there you can see the Atoll missile, the very old-style Atoll missile. And if you could maybe go back just one screen, I don't know if that's possible, you'll see a young Eduardo Gonzalez standing next to, yes, that's young Eduardo Gonzalez, taken in July 1976, standing next to a MiG-21 MF, next to those Atoll missiles. If we could move to the next screen, and the Atoll missile, very familiar shape to anyone who's ever seen the AIM-9B, which it really was just a copy of that. One of them fell into the hands of the Soviets, and then they used it from there. You could go to the next screen, please. There was the Mirage F1, a fairly unique photo of the Mirage F1 taken back perhaps in the early 80s at Ondangwa, and there we can see the Matra 550, the missile that proved to be not particularly effective in those first two encounters. The DEFA cannon of the Mirage F1s was actually the difference, and obviously the pilot training, the difference between the two in the counter. If we could go to the next screen, please. That's the gun camera footage from the very first kill, 6th of November 1981, Johan Rankin. Interesting that in Dick Lord's book, the gun camera, somehow the gun camera photos often got switched around in Vlamgat. But that is the moments where Damacio Valdez aircraft started disintegrating around him, and he managed to eject some minor injuries, but he got out of that. If we can go to the next screen, please. And that is the encounter with Rachel Morero that Cobus Toerien will be all too familiar with. Massive explosion, hard to believe that anything could actually survive that explosion. But the aircraft did. It was actually the left wing fuel tank busy blowing up and blowing outwards. And if we can move to the next slide, please. That was the result of what you saw in that gun camera footage. All the fuel venting outwards in a massive explosion, but the aircraft still flyable. And that was MiG C-40. In fact, it didn't flew again later in 1986. If we could go, sorry, 1984 until 1986. There's the Beast model that I was chatting about. It's got a longer and a fatter spine. The early ones also came with the 2 serial numbers, but these started arriving in 1981, flown by Cuban pilots and often Russian technicians doing the maintenance on them. We can go to the next slide, please. And there it is with the R-13M missiles. You can see there it's got a slightly more pointier nose, and it's starting to look more like a later model Sidewinder missile. And that's how they would have them in the air-to-air role, or when they were on standby, with a belly tank and the 4 missiles. If we can go to the next screen, please. So they're a lot more effective seeker head, able to pull more Gs. In essence, I would say that this missile was probably ahead of the Matra 550, but there were no encounters between these and the Mirages. In 1982, in Cobus's combat, 2 MiG-21Bs were scrambled after the combat, but they got to the scene too late, and by then the Mirage F1s had already gone back to Ondangwa. Go to the next screen, please. So while the Cubans had withdrawn their air operations to their defensive line that they generated, supplies continued into Angola. And late 1983, but flying by 1984, came 2 variable geometry aircraft. The first of them was the Su-22. This is the M2 version, and later in the war there would be the M4 version, but this was the M2 version. Not really too pertinent to our discussion today, other than this was probably then their most capable ground attack aircraft. Big, large, dedicated ground attack aircraft. The capability was improving all the time. These were not flown by the Cubans at all, only Soviets and Angolans flew the Su-22. Go to the next screen, please. But there was another shape in the Angolan skies that came in 1984, and this was one that would have a large effect on the war. Some of these photos being shown here are quite unique. They come from the collection and stuff that was shared to me by Eduardo and Milton Diaz. So the MiG-23 arrived on the scene, and this would be the MiG-23 ML. Now, the MiG-23 up to then hadn't had such a great reputation, and one of the reasons for this was that the MiG-23s used in the Arab wars had often been the lesser version, the MS version or the M version, but the ML version was an extremely capable aircraft. We could go to the next screen, please. And they were delivered to Angola, still under Soviet warranty, so there were still Soviet ground technicians working on them, but Cuban pilots were flying them. And it was a quantum leap in anything that had gone before. It had a really powerful afterburning engine, but the big thing is that it had a radar and missile suite combination that was very effective in the right hands. Could go to the next screen, please. It didn't have an auspicious start. In late 1984, 4 MiG-23s did a strike mission deep into eastern Angola, and 3 of them were lost in that mission, running out of fuel on the way home. And it was actually interesting because here the MiG-23 was being used in a role that it wasn't actually made for. This was actually a real thoroughbred aircraft in terms of the air-to-air war, and when it was used for mud moving or ground attack, it was far less effective. But a couple of features in this photo. One is that big nose, and inside there was that Sophia radar, which NATO codenamed the Highlock, I think. And this radar was extremely effective and very modern, and the way it integrated with its missiles made it a very capable interceptor or air-to-air opponent. Go to the next screen. And just a small chat about some of the missiles. So the big missile that you see there underneath the shoulder mount of this MiG-23, that's the R-24R. You can see it's got a fairly pointed nose. Radar-guided missile, so linked in nicely with the Sophia radar. And on launch, it could do beyond visual range. So now the first time they had a missile that had a beyond visual range capability, probably similar to something like an early to mid Sparrow capability. The R-24R, once launched, it had to keep continuous radar lock, so the aircraft had to keep locked onto the target, and then it would integrate with the aircraft's radar all the way to impact with the target. If we could just go to the next screen, please. The other missile is the R-24T. Now you can see that underneath the shoulder mount of the MiG to the right-hand side of the photo there. It's got a more rounded nose. Now, the R-24T was an infrared missile. It also linked in with the Sophia radar in the sense that the radar would acquire the target, the aircraft radar would acquire the target, feed the data to the R-24T, which then would allow the missile's infrared seeker head to seek out the target, lock onto it, and once it had locked onto it, once the MiG launched that missile, the missile became totally autonomous. It would track down the target on its own, and the MiG could break away and go back to base. Yes, these missiles actually were launched against SAF aircraft, and the SAF wasn't even aware that they were used. In April 1986, an R-24R and later an R-24T were launched against a SAF Hercules, actually two SAF Hercules, low level, deep into Angola. The R-24R was a bit of a failure. It impacted somewhere in the ground, but the R-24T tracked in on its target, passed so close to the Hercules engines that it left stains on the engine itself and left little weld marks from the molten metal on the belly of the Hercules. The missile shot off into the distance. Luckily, the proximity fuse didn't work, and the missile just went and fall off far into the distance, and the Hercules crew were left wondering what had actually been shot at them. And the SAF thought it had been a surface-to-air missile, not realizing that a MiG flown by Eduardo Gonzalez had actually closed in on that Hercules and nearly shot it down. The fact that they didn't realize it was an air-to-air missile was also an indicator that the SAF wasn't quite in touch with how the air-to-air capability was developing on the other side. And this would come home a little bit later. If we can go to the next screen. The missile that really would have the biggest impact of the war was that small missile you see underneath the belly there of the MiG-23. That would be the R-60, the AA-8 Aphid. A true dogfighting missile, short and stubby, capable of high G maneuvers. Contrary to opinion that came about later, it didn't have a true head-on capability. It had a very, very small head-on window, but the manual, if you translate it directly from Russian, says that should the head-on window pick a target up, its chance of hitting the target is extremely high. The pilots, when they did work with the R-60 missile in their trials in various ranges, loved it. It seemed to never ever miss the target when it was launched against various flares, etc. The technician there working on an R-24R underneath the wing of the MiG-23. Just an interesting side note, the R-24T, the thermal version of that R-24R that you see there, did actually hit one aircraft in the war, and that would be in 1988 when it hit the president of Botswana's business jet, the Hawker Sidney HS-125. But that's a story for another day, and that jet was very lucky to survive. Go to the next screen, please. So here we got to 1987, and this photo of MiG-23 taking off at Monongwe in the air-to-air configuration, except that's got, it's got two underwing tanks, which they seldom used that, mostly just the belly tank, because the underwing tank, they couldn't sweep the wing back with the underwing tank on, so mostly they would have to jettison it then. But this was the aircraft that would then come up against the SAF in 1987. And the SAF wasn't really fully aware of its capabilities. And facing up against this aircraft would be the same Mirage F1. Could go to the next screen. Mirage F1s were deployed to Rundu, and there was going to be a confrontation. But the Mirage F1 back from 1982, 1981 combats hadn't changed. Not much had changed at all. The Mirage still had the same radar, pretty ineffective radar, the same ineffective Matra 550 missile. All that they really had were really well-trained pilots, and they tried to compensate with better training, better tactics. But it really was like a a boxer facing another boxer where the one boxer is getting bigger and stronger all the time, and the boxer on our side, on the SAF side, the only really weapon they had was to try and box more clever. If you could go to the next screen. Unfortunately, the result was inevitable. They were coming up against an aircraft that had beyond visual range missiles, true dogfighting missiles, and we all know about the unfortunate incident with Arthur Piercy and Mirage 206. The outcome, as bad as it was that day for the SAF and for Arthur, could have even been worse, because the MiGs were actually locked onto the Mirage with their beyond visual range, or one of them was locked on with the beyond visual range missile and could have launched beyond visual range. But a bit of a mix-up between the lead and the wingman delayed the launch until they got within dogfighting parameters, and then the R60 was used. But basically the lesson had struck home with the SAF, that they had fallen behind in terms of the air-to-air capability. Next photo, please. And we know that then 3 Squadron and the Mirages withdrew from trying to take on the MiGs, which was a very sensible decision. But things were also evolving from the other side even more. This is a snapshot from Eduardo's little Bible that he made up when he was there. And this is how they were trying to increase the or improve the tactics. The big thing with the MiG-23 is it's always short of fuel. This is profiles that they started test flying in 1988 out of Monongwe, taking off without afterburner, flying with 4 R60s, leaving the big beyond visual range missiles behind, lessen the drag, and trying to give themselves more time in the cap position. So they were trying to improve all the time from their side. Next screen, please. But one of the biggest changes from their side came in 1988. When the big battles at the Lomba River had died down, Fidel Castro had a very clever outlook on the war. And he had always believed in coming down the western side. He always felt that the South African Defence Force was more exposed in that area and the terrain suited them more. And when they started to come down the western side, things started to become quite tense, and then there was obviously the incident at Kalawek. But what was not known at all to the SAF at that stage, that even while the events at Kalawek were unfolding, 12 of these MiG-23 BNs had already been loaded on a ship that were on the way from Cuba to Angola. Fidel Castro did that on his own without permission from the Soviet comrades, and his take on this was that he always felt that unless he could strike at the South African Air Force bases, he always had one hand tied behind his back. And here we had an aircraft entering the fray that was a lot more capable than any other aircraft in the Angolan conflict, from their side at least, in terms of ground strike. Go to the next slide, please. Here's a photo of the MiG-23BN while deployed in Angola. They fortunately only arrived in about August. They were never used in combat because by then the peace negotiations had developed to a certain stage. But that MiG-23BN had the ability to carry a much larger bomb load than a MiG-23ML, and not only carry a larger bomb load, but carry it for a further distance, because the engine was optimized and didn't use for ground attack and didn't use that much fuel. And even if you look behind the main landing gear, there's even another hard point right at the back of the MiG-23BN where additional bombs could be carried. It was a very, very capable bomb carrier. Go to the next screen, please. Eduardo Gonzalez was extremely experienced on the MiG-23BN, and in his third tour in 1988, one of his main tasks was to draw up attack profiles for the MiG-23BN against Grootfontein, because that was the one Air Force base that was always out of their reach. The MiG-23ML just couldn't really get there. But two things were changing that were making Grootfontein potentially very vulnerable. One was the new airfield at Kahama. The other one was the possible introduction of the MiG-23BN. So this profile shows that the MiG-23BN from Monongwe could do a strike against Grootfontein and return and either deliver 2 120-kilogram bombs or 2 C-24 missiles, or the X-23 missile, which is like a bullpup missile, really. And it could still make it back to Monongwe with a single belly tank, which is quite remarkable. Now, can you imagine how much ordnance it would be able to deploy against Grootfontein if they were allowed to take off out of Kahama, which is so much closer? So the threat on the other side was developing, and the SAF didn't really develop its defensive capabilities as much as what it perhaps could have in the mid-80s. And that left the Air Force bases pretty vulnerable. Not that the SAF wasn't doing anything. If we can go to the next screen, please. By 1988, the Snake or the Python missile was already being test flown by Carlo Cagliano and other guys on the Mirage F1. But test flown, it could have been bought in a couple of years earlier. If it could have been bought in 1988, it could have been bought in earlier. But it was probably a case of too little, too late for late 1980. If the war had escalated in the second half of 1988, it would have been quite a tough campaign for the SAF trying to defend its bases and to even have a decent footprint in northern Namibia. You can go to the next screen, please. One can speculate about many things, but the one thing in the end is that it's fortunate that in the end sanity prevailed from both sides and peace was the winner. Otherwise, who knows? We might have well had a situation where we would have had the sight of MiGs turning and burning overhead our bases as far south as Grootfontein. And on their side, they had a continually increasing capability in terms of assets and also number of assets, where we were constrained by a number of assets. We had a limited amount of aircraft and we just couldn't afford to lose any. They could afford to lose many. And in the end, yeah, I think it would be very interesting should things have continued. But yeah, that's from my side.
Thanks, Hano. Can you maybe join in with some questions?
Definitely. Good evening. Firstly, Lionel, thank you very much for that. And congratulations to you and to Eduardo on a marvelous book. I really enjoyed the read thoroughly. Thank you for the personal signed copy. I will cherish this next to General Lord's books and Wamosi's book there in my bookshelf. So it's really, and also to Cobus for your part in that. And of course, Sean's sketches is absolutely marvelous. Fighter pilots with a lot additional talents there. So well done to that. And of course, if it wasn't for the book, we wouldn't be here tonight. Thank you very much. Well done. And please also portray the message to when you speak to the Colonel again, Colonel Saria. It's really a marvelous book. I would like to maybe start with Cobus. I just wanted to go back to the 1981 engagement where, of course, 81, 82, he was involved in the 82 engagement. At that stage, of course, the F1CZ still had a little bit of an upper hand. And the question is actually why to Cobus. And I maybe want to lead by, I think you touched on it, Lionel, the fact that I think our pilots were really well trained. We'll get to the air-to-ground bit just now, but in air-to-air, 1v1s, 2v1s, 2v2s, really good trained. I think they were well trained as pairs. And one thing of the MiG-21, and I would like, Cobus, for you to maybe elaborate on that. I understand that the MiG-21, the lookout in the cockpit wasn't as optimal as in the Mirage F1. Did that play a role? And Cobus, you were online earlier.
Yeah, I'm still here. Hi, thanks, Hanu and Hanu and Everett, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, Lionel's actually summarized it so nicely, and the MiG-21 was worse than what we had in the F1. The F1 you could see fairly backwards, but the bottom line is there are guys that were flying during the cross. Both guys were actually with their heads down in the cockpit. And, I couldn't understand that when we crossed. And everybody said, how can you see that? Because now we're crossing at Mach 2, the relative speed. And but it's similarly to, for instance, when the Messerschmitt, the 109s, had that cockpit, something like that compared to the Spitfire. So I think basically they couldn't have, yeah, you're right, they couldn't really look to the back. What they had in their favor, and Lionel would agree, although we look more to the air combat part, but to look further and bigger, what we didn't have then as well was radar coverage. You know, we consistently flew there in the topper parts of the lobe, in other words, almost in red radar, where these guys always fly in green radar. We call it red and green radar. So in that hand, they had that, that was already in 81. The other thing is, eventually, as the war escalated, you know, everything escalated except our equipment just remained the same. And one needs to see it in this context as well. For instance, their radar coverage. I mean, they had radar everywhere. Eventually, even in 81, 82, they could see us, but we couldn't see them. They had mission controllers that were so good that they brought them so close in that we nearly had a middle collision before we saw them. Our mission controllers were very good as well, but they had to work with radars that's on and off. And we still have the old Marconis. We didn't have all the radar that came in later after the war. What they also had is missile umbrellas, as we call it. You know, SAM-3s at Labonga that shot quite a few, that hit quite a few F1s with them, but they managed to get back. So I don't want to give you a long answer to a short question, but for sure, I think the upper hand we had was just, it's like Gary Player said, the more you practice, the luckier you get. We had, at least at the time, I think I had 1,500 hours. We did ACM sometimes 2-3 times a day, every day, which those guys didn't have that, they didn't have that, let's call it privilege, if you can, or opportunity to do so. So I think in that time that we were better purely because of the way we prepared. But like Nyla said, you know, flying with the equipment we had, unfortunately, even our radar, you know, we had to compensate, and I think that's how we compensated. But we grossly underestimated the Cubans. And then just the last thing, and I realized then that we were flying missiles. And I know now why it's called a missile. They were flying with Hittites, although fortunately they never hit. And I think Lionel, in his book, also mentioned, imagine Eduardo hit the 2 C-130s at the time. It would have changed the war dramatically. Sorry, I know it's now a long answer to your short question.
That is awesome. Thank you very much. That's focusing more on the Air Force side. I think one aspect where the South African Air Force and the one squadron guys will like this now has always really excelled is specifically in the low-level tactical environment, which I yourself were probably involved in as well. And as the guys always said, the best trainer is a AAA to get you down to low level. So I think we because of the fact that we didn't have air superiority always deep into Angola, because of the fact that they had very good anti-aircraft systems, good radar. Of course, we were forced to go low level. 24 squadron, 1 squadron. The Impalas did unbelievably well, and the guys developed unbelievable tactics at low level. Mosi, of course, talked also about that. But maybe to Lionel, to yourself, or to Cobus, you also mentioned that the MiG-17s were used in air-to-ground roles on their side. The MiG-21s were used in air-to-ground roles. How did their low-level tactics? Did you go into that? How did their low-level tactics differ from ours? Yes, they were operating, of course, inside their own blue radar. Didn't really venture into enemy territory for them. But did you find that their low-level or their strike tactics was a lot different from ours? Lionel, maybe yourself, and then Cobus?
Yeah, their attitude to low-level flying was very different to ours. And Eduardo is the first person to concede that the SAF were the masters of low-level. And I think the aircraft that they had weren't that suited to low-level attack in terms of the systems on board. The MiG-21 was pretty basic. The MiG-23 ML didn't really have a integrated ground attack system at all. And that's one area where the MiG-23 BN would have made a huge difference. That had a capability in terms of an INS system that was really good, and an autopilot that was designed around ground attack. So as Eduardo said, you could actually program into the BN your whole attack profile. So you would fly an attack from Monongwe to Grootfontein at maybe 400 foot or somewhere around about there, and the aircraft you could actually program it in. The aircraft would fly the profile, and you would simply click the autopilot out to do the pitch up. It really was a more capable aircraft than what they'd had before. So the equipment that they had wasn't well suited to low-level ground attack. Their training also wasn't suited to it, and I think it's an area where the SAF was comfortably ahead of them. However, all of those advantages would have been negated if we no longer had bases like Ondangwa and Grootfontein to operate out of. Because if they did start hitting those bases, would South Africa have taken the chance of keeping aircraft at those bases? I mean, we just couldn't afford to lose aerial assets. We just couldn't.
Yeah. That's a very, very valid point. Cobus, you want to add maybe?
I think we grew up in the environment because of all the AAA, the anti-aircraft guns and missiles that we had to fly low. Even in the M days, I remember, we grew up low level. I mean, the chopper guys even lower. And I don't think perhaps they didn't have the need to really do that. Maybe also to the latest part in the war, Lionel, if I'm correct, where the MiG-23 started attacking as well. There was no threat from the ground. And if I recall correctly, there are only 3 aircraft most probably that was shot down by air to ground from our side was one with the Cactus, the Grotale, if I'm not mistaken, and 2 aircraft shot down by Russian captured SAM 9s, yeah. So that's quite interesting. So it's difficult to say, but I think it's just the way we operated, we had to do that in order to survive. And then we were flying, escorting the cameras. I mean, we were running in low. The Mirage 3s, the reconnaissance guys, they flew extremely low. In fact, Piet van Zyl, Glen Warden, late Glen Warden, we told them, guys, step up. If we lose you, we're on your own. And I think our tactics evolved from the beginning to try and compensate for their the very good AAA and SAM. So when the SAM 8 came in, I mean, we were the first ones to pick it up. One thing that I must mention, where Mossi Basson came in, and that helped us a lot, even if it was just listening and giving feedback to Mossi, and then they started building the V3s, was electronic warfare. You know, we had LBF and the F1, call it galloping horses, and fortunately the day we escorted a Mirage 3 reconnaissance aircraft on the way, leisurely flying back past Kahama. We had in the French BF, so they just call it galloping horses, and Ed van Raffelstein was on my right hand side and I was left. He broke left and I broke right. How we missed each other, I don't know. And we couldn't see where the Mirage 3 went. He had a damsel, what was called. So on his little display, which Mossi and them built, it says 8. And Mossi was jumping up and down, and when we came home, he said, we found the SAM 8. And he asked, you need to track it now. Will we fly a sortie again and just see you get another line? I said, thank you. Our danger pay is not that much.
Yeah, when Mossi is a legend, I sometimes wonder if we didn't enjoy being in the bush with the Reddies more than being in the cockpit. But anyway.
Yeah, but that helped us a lot.
Yes. But maybe in terms of I got the feeling from the book and from previous books that because they were doing their strikes in their friendly radar, they weren't needed to be low level like we were, because we went into enemy radar. Mm-hmm. Of course, I think it was during your sortie and the first one, you guys were actually on standby for them harassing our troops quite often. And then the moment you get airborne, then they will get out of the way, and that's why you actually went in low level. So actually, the next question is actually in terms of force multipliers, and the fact that, yes, we only got the Boeing 707s a little bit later in the 1980s. But would it have helped if we maybe have put the 707 up on friendly side? I know the CZ didn't have air-to-air refueling. The AZ had air-to-air refueling, although it wasn't our primary air warfare mission or machine. Would it have helped to be a little bit of a deterring factor for them if the F1s were flying caps, maybe using air-to-air refueling, do you think? Cobus?
Yeah, definitely. But remember one thing that's actually, and Lionel mentioned something that I was always wondering about. We at the time asked, sorry, to ask you a question first. yes, if we had flown there, it presented maybe a nice target. At a stage 2 squadron was out of the war as well, because they're not going to fly in there when with head-on missiles and things are coming in. And they flew, there was a name for that, they flew around the base. There's a nice Afrikaans word for it, but I'm sure I mustn't use it, but it's like a miskreier tor, they died tor. And at summer we thought it worked. The question we had, why are we attacking small targets? Why don't we go and take out an airport or take out Namib, the harbour? And we got the answer. Remember that time Pik Botha was our honorary colonel. We got a lot of insight through him and our Chester Crocker as well. It was not a conventional war. So it's almost as the politicians agreed, listen, I don't attack your airfields, you don't attack mine. And like Lionel said, we were so vulnerable. When we spoke with Eduardo, says, and there was a General Del Pino as well, if I'm not mistaken, and we had contact with him, and he always said, this is what we had. He's a an Angolan guy, and then we said to him, this is what we had. And he asked, what did you have at Ondangwa? So we had 2 Beauforts and a Hilda missile. And he was laughing. I said, yes, that's what we had. If there's a concentration or an operation on the go, then we will get the Oerlikon thing. No, you don't mess with the Oerlikon. So fortunately, that was a deterrent. And I think that was what it hindered us to really gain what we wanted to, because you cannot take out their bases, but then they didn't take out our bases. I mean, Ondangwa was there in the open. If you come past with your Datsun Bakkie with a few RPGs, you could have taken out a lot of people. Or equipment, for that matter.
Yes. Lionel, just in terms of historical writing and historiography, how did the authors go about writing up the book from different accounts and sources, and how did you collate and verify the sources?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question, because so much of the stuff happened a long time ago, and so what we did is we interviewed as many people as possible, and to try and cross-check various sources against each other. And the funniest things happened at sometimes. Sometimes you just got a conflicting opinion that you couldn't resolve, and you just had to keep on digging, and then suddenly you'd get someone who would corroborate the one side or the other side. For example, the 2 Hercules that were nearly shot down that night, for a long time the Hercules crews couldn't remember who was flying lead and who was flying 2. And then finally, when I tracked down enough of the Hercules guys and interviewed them, you could find out who was actually lead and who was 2. They all remembered who the missile went closest to. And another thing that we decided with this book, it's not a historical encyclopedia of the war. It's the account of what it was like and what it was like to be there. So once we made that decision, we made the decision that the pilots' versions would rule supreme. So if there was a conflict between what a historical record said and what the pilot's logbook said, we took the pilot's logbook as being correct. Because if you've ever had somebody in your gun sights, or you've ever been in somebody's gun sights, you're not going to forget that day, and you're not going to get that day wrong. So a very interesting thing, if you look at Dick Lord's book, it'll tell you a certain date at which all the helicopters were shot down, and I think he said it was the 29th of September. I'm not sure how that came about, because when I was chatting to Eduardo, who was flying top cover that day, he said, no, his book says 30th of September. So I thought, maybe he's got it wrong. Then I checked with Wayne Westerby. Wayne Westerby's book also said the 30th, and so on. And then more and more guys, Nephi van der Heever, then had in his book, in his logbook, also said the 30th. And so in the end, it can only be if all those pilots have got those events noted as the 30th of September instead of the 29th. I don't know how the records that Dick Lord used said the 29th, but we went for the 30th, and that's what that's when we got to stuff like that. That's how we went about doing it.
And Lionel, what do you think that both sides learn about the air war in Angola and air power following this book and sharing these different perspectives and experiences of the war?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is the gap between perception and capability. You know, we were very lucky. Cobus touched on something earlier. They actually perceived the Cactus as being a very effective missile. They were actually nervous of the Cactus, and they saw that as being one of the biggest threats should they ever hit our bases. Cobus said earlier that the Cactus may have got a kill in 1988. From what I understand, speaking to the 250 ADG guys, is it didn't get a kill, but it did damage one MiG-21. But the Cactus never did get a kill in the war, or a verified kill in the war. But also in 1988, the Cactus had its one hand tied behind its back, because when it deployed there, it deployed without its radar setup. And then from our side, after the, you know, everyone, I think, from the SAF Fighter Command underestimated the capability of the R60 or the AR-8 effort. And then after Arthur's unfortunate incident, I think the head-on capability of that missile was overestimated. Where the Cubans didn't see it as a head-on missile. It had a small head-on option, but they didn't see it as a true head-on missile. Whereas we then saw, wow, this thing's really, really good head-on. Where it wasn't. It had a very small window. So I think at times there were some real intelligence failures in the war, or a lack of understanding about what the other side had to bring. So it's quite interesting when you start comparing the two sides and see the gap between what their perception was, what our perception was, and what the various capabilities were.
And maybe just want to add, and an example of that comes up very nicely in the book is actually the night capability. But as you mentioned with the C-130s, where they are to fire those two missiles, I sometimes get the feeling that the SAF wasn't aware that they had a night fighter capability.
Yeah, it really is one of the mysteries. How did we not get to know that? I think because looking through records of some of their logbooks, they flew a lot of night training missions. They even flew out of Monongwe. They flew them out of Huambo. They flew them out of Lubango regularly. That's how they kept their night flying currency. It was mostly out of Lubango. And Eduardo was one of the top night flying instructors. So they did work on their night flying capability all the way around. And I mean, we were so lucky with the Hercules incident. I mean, what Eduardo did that night was pretty remarkable to track down a Hercules low level between the mountains around the Huambo. It was almost a mission where he deserved the kill, but as he said to me, I'm just so happy that missile missed, because now he's personal friends with those guys. And that to me is one of the best outcomes of the book.
Yes. Lionel, what do you think that the authors learn about the experience of the Cuban, the Angolan, and the Soviet actors during this air war in Angola?
Well, I think working on the book, I think everyone who worked on the book or even just contribute to the book, I think what we learned is that we were also similar in the end. You know, it's amazing that at the time it was dehumanizing. You see the other guys not, you know, in a way. And I think it just afterwards and working on the book, just realized how human we all are. And the guys that I interviewed from their side, the Angolan side, the Cuban side, the Soviet side, were just amazing characters, just gentlemen, and it gave a lot of credit to the SAF, and came to realize there was a lot of respect actually between the pilots, a lot of professional respect. And years down the line, you know, all the egos and the differences have subsided, and that also made the book interesting to work on, because people were able to speak honestly, you know, even things that weren't very flattering to them. They were quite open and honest about it. And yeah, I think just in the end, we all had to deal with very similar challenges. I mean, the Southern Angolan weather, upper command, not always understanding the challenges of the guys on the ground. Yeah, short runways, poor facilities. Many of the challenges that the enemy had were the challenges that we had at times. There's a saying called Kriegskameraden. I think it's a German saying that, and it basically is people who fought against each other have a sort of comradeship later after the war, and I think that came out for me in the book.
Yeah. Right, gentlemen, thank you very much for your discussion and your revelations. It was very interesting. I know Hanu said to me at some stage when he finished the book, he had a lot of wow moments when he read it. Please allow me just to thank a few people who made this discussion possible. Firstly, our panel for their participation and sharing their insights. Hanu, thank you for helping with the planning and all the arrangements. Hanu, thank you for doing the book review and your expert inputs for this discussion. Henri Delport, the co-editor of Militaria, for all the marketing as well as the running of the online platform and interaction. Jannie Smit for providing the technical support in the background. Professor Everett Kleinhans, our editor of Militaria, our chief editor, thank you for your support. And last but not least, Lionel, please convey our thanks and appreciation to Eduardo for his contribution to the body of knowledge on air power in Angola and his support for initiatives like this. So thank you very much. And Cobus, thanks for your participation as well.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks very much, James.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you very much.